How somebody emerges out of that, I don't know.
Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now is Shibley Telhami with the University of Maryland, Sadat Professor for Peace, and joining us, and one of the things he does is track American sentiment of Muslims and Islams. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
We'll get about specifically to that topic. Could we start, though, with your thinking of what happened in Brussels and how that affects not only sentiment over there over Muslims, but how that might affect sentiment here?
Well, obviously, you know, public opinion is very sensitive to events. And so when you track it, you know, there's spikes up and down. But in my own opinion, as for American public opinion, I think it's likely not to have a huge effect on it. Because remember, you know, we've gone through 9/11, and 9/11 really formed, you know, had a lot of impact on Americans' views of both Islam and Muslim people. And I don't think they have substantially changed in the past decade. Really, the first couple of years they changed a little bit, and they haven't changed all that much. And also, in addition to that, I think what we see now, because we have such a polarized debate, that you're going to see intensification of the polarization rather than a significant shift in overall American public opinion. Now, as for Europe, that's a different story. I think it's a different story, not because they're more used to it in some ways than we are, because they've faced, frankly, more terrorism on their soil. And over the years, they've learned how to deal with it. But just because of all of the stuff that's happening, particularly with the influx of refugees coming after the Paris attacks, and this happening in Brussels, I think it's clearly hardening views. We see it in many countries. We see it certainly in Germany. And I think it's going to have consequence probably for policy. It's not just going to be a question of attitudes. And I think we have a different issue. We could talk about that a little bit later on. The United States doesn't face the same set of issues. Obviously, there have been some terrorism on our soil. We've faced that, and you know we could face it again. You know we can't prevent even attacks on schools, but in general, the Muslims are more integrated into the American society than are many Muslim communities. I won't say all Muslim communities, many Muslim communities in many Muslim countries, and that has been a problem.
When you take a look then at incidents that have occurred in the United States, does sentiment change? I'm thinking San Bernardino, I'm thinking events in Texas. When you hear about those incidents, does sentiment change then greatly as far as how the perception of not only the people who practice Islam?
On some issues it does. For example, we've seen that on whether or not people are open to absorbing refugees or not. There's an element of fear. It's not even just a philosophical interpretation of what's happening. I mean, frankly, everybody gets afraid. I mean, whether it's going to be liberals or conservatives, they're worried about for their children. But because we've had such a kind of an entrenched transformation of American public opinion toward Islam and Muslims after 9/11, we see the shift not very, very strong. I'll give you an example. With regard to my poll that I conducted, if you look, for example, at initially after the attack on 9/11, actually American public opinion in polls that were taken immediately after 9/11 were not that negative. In fact, they were more positive than negatives of Islam and the Muslim people. And that started shifting with all the coverage and intensification and focus on this issue, and then the war on terrorism and the war in Iraq. And by the end of that decade, over 60% of the American public had negative views of the Islamic religion. Now, this didn't change even in a moment of optimism in 2011, when we had the so-called Arab Spring, what I call the Arab uprisings, really. And we had really American public opinion during that period changed toward Arabs. People started seeing when they saw initially when it was peaceful, before it went, violent, peaceful transformations. Americans started having positive interpretation of what's happening. They were not anti-American. They were not mostly Islamist. The pictures of Tahrir Square in Cairo were, galvanized a lot of people around the world. So 70% of Americans had even positive views of the Egyptian people at that time. Even then, though, opinions of Islam as a religion stayed where they were before, over 60% still negative. And yet, 4 years later, after things have gotten much worse, and we had the rise of ISIS and the beheadings, and then we had, when I did this poll, we had the shooting down of the bombing of the Russian aircraft, and still focus on all these events. And it didn't change much from 2011. It stayed the same level. And the reason for it, in my opinion, is that you have this intensification of polarization of American politics. So when you look at American public opinion, it is two Americas on this issue. It's not one America, and we really forget that. I think we show that American people are, well, no, I'm sorry. We could see it, of course, in our political campaigns. You watch the Democratic debate, you watch the Republican debates. It's not one America. I'm sorry. We're talking about different issues that are, that people are focused on. And you see that on attitudes on this issue. For example, if you ask Americans whether or not they have positive, favorable, unfavorable views of Muslims, you're going to have the Republicans have unfavorable views, Democrats have very favorable views. This holds on multiple issues, including whether there's a clash of civilization between Muslims and the Western world. Mm-hmm. And so what we see, because of reinforcement, because you've got a Republican narrative and you've got a Democratic narrative and you've got the independents caught in between. So yes, there's transformation, but people are holding on to their interpretations even in the middle of fear, and there is fear. And obviously, an understandable fear that people have that comes out of all these events that are frightening to people.
The survey that our guest referenced came out in December of last year. You can find it on a C-SPAN website. It'll show you some information as far as sentiment is concerned. We'll take a look at that as we go throughout the morning. But if you want to ask our guest, Shibley Telhami, questions about American sentiment of Muslims and Islam, here's how you can do so. 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and 202-748-8002 for Independents. Also, Muslim Americans, if you want to ask and give your thoughts as well this morning, 202-748-8003. We'll take a call from Steve. Steve is in Indianapolis, Indiana, Democrats line. You're on with our guest, Shibley Telhami. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, thank you for taking my call. Yeah, with the poll that he has taken, he could take that poll with, and like he just said, it is two different Americas, and I can't imagine how it's going to be if a Donald Trump or a Ted Cruz got in with the Islamic extremists out here. That's a breeding ground for them, for guys with views like they have. Now, he said that Republicans are, they don't like the Islamic faith at all, and that Democrats they're just tolerable. Democrats tolerate the religions and they accept them, but nobody accepts the extremism. But this is going to be a breeding ground for them with views like Donald Trump has, for not just for that, but his extremist views on everything.
Steve, thank you. Mr. Telhami.
Well, yeah, I mean, put Trump aside. I mean, we're in the middle of political campaign. I don't really know what his set of beliefs are, and obviously even the public generally doesn't know what politicians believe or don't believe. But there is a narrative, and the narrative not only is about the source of the problem in the Middle East. That some people, obviously, we see that in some of the polling, more on the Republican side in general, that think Islam itself is the problem. It's not just militant Islam, that there's somehow, the theology of Islam lends itself to more militancy. So we have that kind of rhetoric. You don't find that on the Democratic side. You don't find a profound clash of civilization assumption, and you don't find that even among the public in general. So the majority of the American public, for over 57%, actually think there is no clash of civilization. But you will find people who think that's... So there's a clash of narrative, first of all, about is this just a minority, militant groups that we need to focus on, just like the administration is putting on. Like most analysts, I think, at least academic analysts, think that to be the case. But there is that other school. The other school of thought is also about what do you do inside America. I mean, frankly, we have a significant Muslim population in America. Of course, there are varying estimates as to what that is, because we do, not in the census, so they're really estimates, but large, significant numbers. And whether or not, just like some of our candidates are suggesting, you start watching them because of their religion or because of their ethnicity, or whether that would be counterproductive. And what we see is the argument, certainly where I fall, is that, if you see one of the big assets of America is that, in fact, we don't focus on people because of their religion and ethnicity, and we treat everybody in America, unless they're proven out, unless we have specific reason to to target them, and then we should, obviously, everybody would agree on that. Doesn't matter what their ethnicity or religion is. But we don't, and the more you treat communities like they are, unusual or they're suspect, the more they behave that way. And I say in my polling, whether it's here in America or in the Muslim world, we are what we have to defend. Everybody is complicated. A Muslim is not just a Muslim. A Muslim is an American. A Muslim could be Pakistani, could be an Egyptian, could be a Lebanese. A Muslim is a citizen of the world. A Muslim is a professor, a teacher, a lawyer, a laborer, whatever they are. They're all these things. And when you then identify them specifically by focusing on one aspect of them and say, this is the one I want to label you with, what happens? People rally behind that, and that label starts determining who they are and what they are, and they rally and they bond over it, and that becomes more problematic than it is an asset. That's the reason why I think this is wrong, and this could be counterproductive, and this is what America is not what America is about. And if we move in that direction, we're in trouble as a nation, whether it's we're looking at Hispanics, or whether we're looking at Muslims, or whether we're looking at Jews, or whether we're looking at whatever it is that we're looking at. That would be counterproductive.
It was Ted Cruz this week in response to what events in Brussels, who was on CBS, talked about his views as far as what should be done, particularly in Muslim communities, as he described it. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
If you're concerned with gang violence is a real problem in a lot of places across the country. What does law enforcement do with proactive policing? You go into the neighborhoods where gang violence is a problem and you work proactively to get the gang members off the street. And by the way, the people you're protecting are the residents of those communities who are typically the victims with gang violence. It is often African Americans and Hispanics. It's low-income Americans who are often the victims of those violence. And by having a serious police presence there, you are protecting those communities. The same is true in the Muslim community, where radical Islamic terrorists, they don't just murder Christians and Jews, they murder other Muslims as well. And we need to fight and defeat radical Islamic
Senator,
terrorists.
you know that survey.
Mr. Telhami, what do you think about that analogy?
Well, first of all, it's as if we have segregated communities in America. When we say, oh, well, go to these communities. What are you talking about? I mean, I have a neighbor who is a Muslim and a neighbor who is Jewish and a neighbor who's, what are we talking about? I mean, we're talking about people are dispersed. People are not just concentrated because of the religion in America. You might have some in some areas where there's more of a cluster of certain communities, but that's not what we have. Second, I mean, what are we talking about in terms of who's police targeting? As the New York police chief pointed out, there are over 1,000 Muslim policemen in New York alone. In the U.S. military, we have over 5,000 people in the U.S. military who are Muslim. So what are we talking about? We're talking about, in the FBI. What do you think? The FBI doesn't have many Muslims or Arab who are genuine American working out so how do we break that down? And then if you know that police is breathing down your neck, and they're only identifying you because you're a Muslim, it's a problem. After 9/11, there was a woman, a lawyer from New York who's a Muslim, who wrote a wonderful piece in the New York Times right after, and said something like, last week I was thought of myself as a feminist, as a New York woman lawyer, as a New Yorker, and this morning I wake up and I'm thinking of myself as a Muslim, as a suspect, as a person not belonging. I'm paraphrasing. And so that's what happens. What happens is not you make people feel out of place, and they start, and the more they're threatened, the more they rally behind that aspect.
Let's hear from Brad in Michigan, Republican line. Hi.
Hi. I think what Cruz said was perfectly right. I mean, it's just it's logic and common sense. What we have is a president that wants to pander to anybody other than the American people. I mean, he's more worried about keeping his image of being a liberal guy than he is about protecting the country. And he's more interested, in that than anything. People are sick of political correctness. I got no problem with Muslims. And I'll believe that Muslims are against it when I see on a regular basis there are leaders out there saying we're going to turn you in, we want nothing to do with ISIS, blah, blah, blah. But I don't. It's just like lip service right now. And
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's put, I didn't really mean to respond specifically to Cruz or Trump or the president for that matter. But let's look at, sort of the question of what the president is doing. Is he, quote, pandering, not to the American people, but to outsiders? I mean, when you look at it, first of all, on the American people, a majority of the American people, 57%, think we don't have a clash of civilization. A majority of the American people have a positive view of Muslims. And so, even when you're looking at the majority of the American people who may be uncomfortable with Islam, they feel that they have a positive. So the president is actually catering to the majority of the public. Obviously, we're polarized, so you're going to have very determined minorities on each side that wants to pull you in a different direction. That's not what the president is doing. Now, we can argue about the president's effectiveness. That's a whole different question of whether or not his war on ISIS has been as effective as it should have been, why ISIS emerged. And I think that's really the story of the day, because that's what we're talking about, the threat not so much from, quote, Muslim communities, but ISIS and its ability to have reach globally in ways that we didn't expect. I happen to think that ISIS is principally and first and foremost a product of the Iraq War, that it emerged in large part because of that. If you look at what ISIS is, it's really kind of a morphing of Al-Qaeda and some of the fighters of Saddam Hussein regime, who was a secular and not Al-Qaeda, coming out of the Iraq War with the Sunnis feeling threatened, with both going against a Shia-dominated government as well as the United States forces, and emerging to fight, and then the opportunities that opened up with the Arab uprisings that created much more instability that they could exploit in the Middle East and expanded into Syria. So the origins of it has nothing to do with the president per se. It has to do with something else. Now, you could even argue, and some people argue this, I don't know, this is a little bit more complicated about what motivates ISIS itself. I happen to think that when you're looking at ISIS and say, so what's the difference between them and Al-Qaeda? They come out of Al-Qaeda originally. I mean, this was Al-Qaeda in Iraq with, al-Zarqawi operating in Iraq. And so what is ideological difference between them? Well, it's not a lot, because they both use Islam, and mobilize over Islamic symbolism. In that sense, they're both jihadis in that sense. Two, neither one of them likes the West or the United States, for sure. But there was a difference. Whereas ISIS said initially, you know what, we definitely see the West and the U.S. as a threat like Al-Qaeda, but that's not our initial focus. We're going to focus on changing regimes in the Middle East. So the battle initially was actually at home, not abroad. And part of it is that they sensed that the Arab uprisings meant people really wanted change from regimes, and they were focused on that. Remember, the Arab uprisings weren't saying, against the USA, they were all against the regimes. So they mobilized along these lines. So the question, in fact, is whether or not the military intervention by the West may have accelerated the shifting of priorities to target the West. That's a debatable issue. There are people who think both ways on that. But that's so you can go even on the intervention, whether did we intervene enough, or did we intervene more than we should have, that's also debatable.
Pennsylvania, Robert is in Fayetteville, Independent Line with Shibley Telhami. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me here. I think you're all splitting hairs a little too much and ignoring the 500-pound gorilla in the room. ISIS does what it does because it's following the Quran. The Quran says you have the right to have a holy war against the unbelievers, and that's what they're doing. It says that you can behead the unbelievers. It says you can rape the women of your enemy, all kind of other nasty stuff. They're just following that. The Americans in this country, 90% of them, they're secularized and they're following the almighty dollar. They're not good Muslims. ISIS is following their teachings and their beliefs.
Well, I know that's a point of view that's out there, and obviously, the behavior of some people in the Muslim world is abhorrent. Whether it's treatment of women or killing, just like in many other places where we have unacceptable behavior that we ought to condemn. Doesn't matter what they use it to justify, whether they use religion or something else, and there's too much of it, and we need to condemn it, and we have to take a position on it. Now, whether or not it really derives out of religion and the Quran is a whole different issue. Why? Because, you know, you and I know that religion can be used whichever way you want to use it. I mean, if I want to use the Old Testament to justify certain things, I could use the story of Samson about, you know, dying and killing the enemy, or do whatever I want to do. The Bible has a lot of things that the Old Testament, particularly the narratives on right and left, that people can use. The question is how people employ it. And over the years, here's what you have to realize, particularly with regard to religion. By and large, in much of the early 20th century, actually religion was used as a stabilizing force, an anti-violent force. In fact, the U.S. made actually alliance with Islam in the Middle East to fight initially the Soviet Union that was atheistic, and to fight the Arab nationalists that were secular, who were using violence more than any of the Islamists. And then we all know what happened in Afghanistan. So, and for that matter, even early 20th century, right after, you know, during World War I, when World War I emerged, most of the Arabs of the region rallied behind the West and fought with the West against the Muslim empire, the Ottoman Empire that is centered in Turkey. So the reality of it is these things are fluid. You know, how people interpret the religion, how they live their lives are fluid. And therefore, the explanation can't be the document itself. It never is, whether it's the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, or any other. And it's wrong to think that way. It's wrong to think that way because it labels a lot of people who are peaceful and faithful. By the way, people think they're religion in the Middle East. Religion, yes. If you ask Egyptian, are you religious, whether actually they're Christian or Muslim, over 90% say yes, they're religious. And yet look at the division among those religious people in Egypt to this day, the polarization between people who want to separate religion from politics and people who don't. The current government and the Islamists, including the mainstream Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood. So societies are divided, even though faith is important to all of them. And it's wrong to just label one interpretation as a dominant interpretation of a particular religion.
Besides his current service at the University of Maryland, our guest was a senior advisor to George Mitchell. He was President Obama's United States Special Envoy for the Middle East Peace. He also served as advisor to the U.S. mission to the United Nations. East Dublin, Georgia, Democrats line. Maurice, hello.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you?
Good morning.
Just as many have used the theory of Ham in the Bible to justify slavery, but I digress from that. Ultimately, there are many things to talk about with regards to this particular issue, but let's just run through a few things. Number one is only 3% of the country, of the United States, identifies itself as Islamic or Muslim. Out of the over 1 billion individuals that identify themselves as Islamic or Muslim in the world, you're only talking about 100,000 or so radicalized individuals. So really, and that, push that aside. This entire conversation really is unnecessary, and it doesn't. And the sub-trends are going to continue. This country, the United States, is only going to become more and more diverse, religiously and demographically, and that's going to include people of the Islamic faith. So we need to have a conversation with regard to that particular issue about what is real. And you can discuss the idea that there is a debate in the Islamic world about modernity and how that needs to come to the fore, or the embrace of modernity, if you want to suppress the idea of radicalism. But everything else is a conversation that is going to continue regardless of what the corporate media wants to have a conversation about. And lastly, we're having these debates now only as a reflection of what is happening in Europe. But what about what has happened in Africa and the racial element that goes into that? Just a few weeks ago, you had this issue in the Ivory Coast. Where was all the media coverage then? And before that, the incidents that have happened in Nigeria and in Kenya. None of these instances of hand-wringing and corporate media and political individuals having these conniptions.
Okay, Maurice, thanks.
Well, I mean, I think, let's separate two questions. One question, which is many Muslim communities around the world, I don't like to use the word, the term Muslim world. I don't really know what that is, but Muslim majority countries, and certainly much of the Middle East, the Arab countries, are going through their own struggle internally. That struggle really doesn't have much to do with the West. I mean, it's an internal dynamic about how they want to define their societies. It's also a fight against authoritarianism and dictatorship. It's a period of change that is empowered by the information revolution. Young people feel much more empowered than before, and they're taking on a system, and they're trying to get involved in politics. It's destabilizing. It's with us to stay. Religion is inevitably going to be part of it, and it's not necessarily the driving force, but it's one of the forces that is at play, and that is, we're going to have to all watch it and deal with it and learn from it, and sometimes worry about the consequences for us and deal with those consequences when they're dangerous. That's a whole different issue. Now, in America, obviously, in addition to how we see the rest of the world, particularly Muslim communities, and how we see these problems and respond to them, which matters, as I said earlier, we also are going through, as the caller said, our own demographic change. And in fact, if you look at why the Democratic Party is enhancing, just because the constituents who are making it are obviously growing. Hispanic Americans, African Americans, a lot of women, young people, typically people who tend to identify with the Democratic Party. And increasingly, we see obviously more Muslims moving in that direction. Muslims historically in America, by the way, have been divided depending on the year. They haven't taken one side or the other as a community. And the same thing with Arab Americans. By the way, Arab Americans, some of whom are Muslim, actually mostly are Christian. Over 60% of them. There's a whole debate about the percentages, in part because we really don't have very good census numbers on either one. But both communities have been divided depending on, but they've been moving more toward the Democratic Party as well. And that demographic change may be what's animating some of the problems. I don't want to, politicians, they're going to do what they do to mobilize support, and sometimes they do the unbelievable. We've seen some of it in our in our debates. The world is shocked. They can't believe what they're hearing when they're hearing some of those things. But part of it is mobilizational. Now, the threat, obviously, all communities respond when there is a sense of threat. And those bombings, let's be fair. I mean, they do scare people, and understandably. I mean, that's natural. That's not just about whether you're on the right wing or the left wing. Everybody feels threatened. So the question is what you make of it. And if I'm a politician and I'm seeing that my base is being threatened demographically, and the other side is adopting a more moderate interpretation of what this is, I would seek to build on this fear to grab more of the support in that direction. So maybe the demographics is playing into it in terms of how our political conversation is changing.
Shibley Telhami joining us. Next call is from Arizona. Mickey on our Republican line. You're next up.
Yes, thank you so much. And I hope I can articulate. I'm calling because I'm so offended. You don't want... well, first of all, I think Republicans have been very careful to call out radical Islams. They're not calling out all Islams. And as you sit there now and you divide Democrats and Republicans, you're doing the same thing that you don't want us to do with Muslims, is to articulate that somehow all Republicans are hateful and they don't like Muslims. I'm so offended.
That's not what I said.
It's just like being called a racist because you're a Republican. It's just so unfair. And I have to just throw this in because of other issues. What I remember about the going into Iraq, what it stands out in my mind was when they got to vote and the joy they had in showing that purple finger. I thought that was a wonderful thing. I think most people want freedom. And I was overjoyed that these people were allowed to vote and do Anyway,
Gotcha, Mickey. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, first of all, you're right about all people want freedom, and I agree with you. I don't know where you got what you said about me. That's not what I said at all. I didn't say that's what Republicans, quote, want. I said some politicians. I referred to some politician and how they're exploiting this issue. But what I said in my poll is actually that about the polling is that when you look at the United States and see ask them, do you believe that Islam is incompatible with Western values or not? What you find is a majority of Republicans say, yes, it's incompatible, whereas among Democrats, overwhelmingly say, over 70% say it is compatible, the two are compatible. So there is a public opinion difference. Not all Republicans, you still have 57% is a slight majority. You're still going to have a significant minority who will not think they're incompatible. And I would add one more element actually to it. So I certainly don't. I agree with you. I mean, I think it's wrong to stereotype anyone as single dimensional, and certainly don't do that about Republicans or independents or Democrats. So I don't know how you got that impression. Sorry if I had given that impression, but that's not what I had said or meant, and certainly that's not what the numbers show. But I want to say one thing about the Republicans. As in terms of Republican public opinion, people who identify themselves as Republicans among the electorate. So what we have is I'm writing a book on the evangelical movement, very important constituency in America. And again, a lot of people misunderstand them because they think they're one-dimensional, and they're not one-dimensional. And the obvious proof is many of them are supporting Trump, who's not coming out of the evangelical community, as opposed to Cruz. Cruz has not done as well as could have been expected within that community. That's because they're not one-dimensional, and that's actually one reason why I'm writing this book. But when you look at the evangelical right, people who are who say they are evangelical, not just born-again Christian, because there's a little overlap between the two communities, they're not identical. People who say, I'm an evangelical, 75% are Republicans. So they're really, that is clustered on the right. So their attitude is similar to the rest of the Republican Party, but on matters related to the Middle East and attitudes toward Islam, they are far more critical than the rest of the Republican Party. So, for example, if you take those who identify themselves as evangelical out of the Republican Party, the Republican Party political attitudes start looking more and more like the rest of the American population. So this is really a critical element. Now, you can argue why the evangelical right has those views, particularly they start with their interest in the Middle East because of the role of Israel in biblical prophecy. And not all of them, but certainly a large segment of them. I polled on that, by the way. That you can go to our website, sadat.umd.edu. You'll find a whole poll on the evangelical, including probing into the theological elements of them. But there is more to it, because the focus on religion and the contrast as they see it between Islam and Christianity, it's more pronounced. So there is a lot more negative views of Islam as a religion, or even the Muslim people as a consequence of evangelical right views within the Republican Party. One more element I want to say that I hope is okay, and that is that one of the things I tested in this is something that's common sense. And the common sense is that we see it all over the world. You know, if you know some people, it humanizes them, and then your attitude shifts. It's not that you love people that you know. It's just that you don't think they're the devil anymore. You think, oh, they're the good, and there's the bad, and there's, you know, everything else that you see with the complexity of people. You don't see them one-dimensional. And so I asked in my polling is, do you know any Muslims? Which one is closer to you? I don't know any Muslims. I know some Muslims, but not well. I know some Muslims very well. That's the question. And so what do we find? We find that those who say, I don't know any Muslims, have the most negative views across the board, whether it's Democrats, Republican, or independent. If they know some Muslim, even not well, they start having favorable views of Muslims. And those who know some Muslims very well have much more favorable views of Muslims across the divide, whether it's Republican, Democrat, and Independent. So that includes Republican. So it tells you, obviously, the dynamics that go beyond this party divide that are taking place. But there is a party divide, and some of that party divide could be even refined more by looking at specific constituencies.
Andy from New York, Independent Line. Hi there.
Hey, it's a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.
This conversation's been going on for 1,000 years. You know, the radical evangelicals, the radical Muslims, me being a progressive, these groups kind of scare me because, you know, you take the evangelicals, they don't believe in climate change. I'm sure the radical Muslims don't believe in climate change and things that are kind of important to progressives, right? But, you know, as far as, like, when I hear, I'm offended by these Republicans always bad-mouthing Obama because Obama, he did do something this week after the attacks. He went after the bad guys. I believe he got number 2, he got number 3. In Somalia, he killed about 150 of them, and we haven't lost any American lives. You know, but it's an extremely interesting conversation. I do have Muslim friends, and I don't think all Muslims are bad by no means. They're a part of America, you know, and most of them are good, loving people. And I don't really believe the Quran says to go out and, you know, for jihad. I don't believe that. There's a small number of them, you know, and but it's an incredibly interesting conversation. I'm enjoying it.
Thank you. Just on I also, you know, I don't look. In my own work, I try to be fair to what I'm studying, and whether I'm studying evangelicals, I'm studying Muslims, Arabs, Israelis. It's a complex story, and you have to try to be fair in the conversation as much as you can. And as I said earlier, I don't really have. It's not just about Muslims, about the evangelicals. I don't stereotype them. They're radicals. I'm not sure it's just radical evangelicals who you have to worry about. Every radical. I mean, basically we have political radicals. You don't need religion to have radicals. I mean, a religion is just one form of radicalism or that lends itself to radicalism. As I said, if you look both here in America, there are a lot of people who may be you know, white supremacist or radical on the left or anarchist who are not necessarily motivated by religion at all. In fact, religion may not be part of their makeup. In the Middle East, as I said, you know, in the radicalism of the 1950s and 60s, which was politically motivated, and it was mostly secular. So I don't really think that religion is the problem. We do have to worry about also how we talk about evangelicals, because they are complex. And clearly they care. And by the way, even though more of them worry about refugees coming from the Middle East because of the fear, more of them also say they're motivated by compassion. So that when you ask them about the golden rule, how important is the golden rule of doing unto other what you want done on yourself, the overwhelming majority says it's the #1 thing for them. So it's how do you manage this fear on the one hand and worry about Islam, and then your sense of compassion. And therefore, it's a fluid conversation, and you can't paint people into a corner where they're forced to take a position just because they're painting them into it, whether they're evangelicals or Muslims. And I have to, you know, say that because to me that we need more engagement, constructive engagement, to play to the good side of people. Everybody has complicated sides, their tendencies. I'm divided within the self about do I go here, do I go there, about making my own views, and I don't want to be painted into a corner. And I find, you know, it's funny because I could be very critical of the American government here on this show. I don't like what we're doing here. I don't like what we're doing here. When I go to the Middle East and I'm appearing on Arab television, or I'm speaking at a conference in Cairo, and I see a lot of people are unjustifiably dumping on the U.S. and saying that America is this, and America is this, and America is this. I find myself rallying behind my Americanism and defending my country, because that's what we are. Even though I'm critical of certain aspects of my country does, everybody is like that.
One more call. Robert, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Democrats line.
Yes, sir. Give me a few minutes. But listen, why is it that you don't say Christian terrorists? why is that you use only Islam and Muslim terrorists and not Christian terrorists? And listen, Christians have killed more people in the world than any people claiming a religion. And not only that, in this country, where black people, now there are two kinds of Christianity in this country. You have black Christianity, African Christianity, or European or so-called white Christianity. There are no white people in general. I'm lying between two white sheets, and nobody I see on TV looks like this. But again, why don't you say the Christian terrorists, when they start bombing here, this is where the bombing started, bombing houses, bombing homes in Birmingham and places like that. And from now on, start saying the Christian terrorists if you're going to say Islam terrorists.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, obviously, that, you know, we tend to label, you know, focus on the Islamist terrorism that's coming in the name of Islam. We call it that. I don't really have a problem with calling it a label. People do call Christian terrorists to be that, particularly people who are the criminals. Maybe they may not be terrorists in the sense of domestic crime, that we call them criminals, people who attack abortion clinics or something in the name of religion. And by the way, in Israel, the terrorists, the Jewish terrorists who attack Palestinians from those, they are called Jewish terrorists in the Israeli press. So I don't really have a problem with that. The problem is broadening that to label people. And I even go one step beyond that in terms of not just pertaining to how we label terrorists. I think what we label as you know, this definition of a Muslim world, I have a little problem with, because you're lumping countries that are so different ideologically, culturally, historically, just because they have Muslim majorities. You know, you're lumping Morocco and Yemen and Egypt and Lebanon and Pakistan and Indonesia, non-Arab countries that are in Malaysia, all together as if there's a single world. Just imagine if we do Venezuela and Russia and America and Switzerland and said that's a Christian world. It just doesn't make much sense, and it hurts more than it helps conceptually, because we elevate the one characteristic about them, which is their religion, to the top. We know they don't behave that way. We know that countries don't behave that way. We know that governments don't behave that way. And yet we think somehow that that's going to gain us some capital. I think we do a disservice by doing that, because we just focus on that one element, which is Islamist. Now, this is not to say that right now we do face a major terrorist organization operating in the name of Islam that uses Islamic theology to mobilize, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or not, and they need to be taken on. So this is not to take away from that. Whatever the reason for that coming into being, it's now a problem, and it's a threatening problem, and it's a threatening problem to Europe, and we have to worry about it as well, and it's a threatening problem to Middle Eastern societies, and we have to confront it as such. So we have to certainly not underestimate that problem and define it for what it is, for sure, but our conversation should be much broader and draw more people into it, because frankly, ISIS and Al-Qaeda is more of a threat to Muslim societies than it's even to the West and America, and they know it in Muslim societies, and don't push them to see us as a bigger threat than ISIS. The worst thing is if they start seeing America as a bigger threat to them than ISIS, and they're forced to choose. Don't put them in that position.
Our guest work on American sentiment towards Muslims and Islam can be found on our Washington Journal website. The charts that you've seen on this program you can read, as well as the report for yourself. Shibley Telhami with the University of Maryland. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
We'll continue our conversation with Nathan Sales. He's at Syracuse University, formerly of the Department of Homeland Security. We'll talk about the potential of terrorists coming into the United States and the various ways that the United States tracks people who come here through the visa program and other means. Nathan Sales of Syracuse University joins us as Washington Journal continues.